Hi, everyone. My name is Alexi Siegel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Academic Enrichment Partnership Specialist with Communities and Schools of Chicago. Hi, everybody that I know. Excited to be here and learn today. And I'll turn it over to Lakia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Lakia Connor, and I am the Health Partnership Specialist here at CIS of Chicago.
Think that's everyone, Fabiana.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. We also have two wonderful speakers joining us today to do the training. We have Andrew, who is the technical assistant specialist with Act Now, drawing on experience as an after-school provider, high school history teacher, and AmeriCorps mentor to help after-school professionals hone their craft. In this position, Andrew has led trainings on neurodiversity in OSD, gender and sexuality in OSD, and workforce development in OSD, as well as providing technical assistance to Teen Reach, Reimagine Public Safety Act programs, and community schools across Illinois. We also have Emma, who is a policy and communications intern with Act Now, and a social work graduate student specializing in community, policy, and advocacy. She has led initiatives to improve inclusion in after-school and OSD programs, including developing toolkits and conducting field assessments. She's passionate about equity and community impact, and she has worked to help youth serving organizations to create inclusive spaces for all. So without further ado, Andrew, would you please share your screen? Let me stop sharing mine.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Glad to see you here, and talking about this really important topic in the field and for, kids all across the country. Um, so we're going to be talking specifically about neurodiversity, as both a goal and as something that you can work towards. And obviously, we're not going to cover, all of the intricacies of neurodiversity in 90 minutes, but this will be an introduction and a chance for you to sort of work through some of these big issues for your own programs and in your own spaces. All right. So, without further ado, let me introduce myself. You heard my bio. Andrew Height Susan, a big scary name with a Z in it. I use he or they pronouns. Either of those work for me. And I work with Act Now, which I'll introduce in a second. I care most about the kids. That's why I do this job. It's why I do every job. It is important to me that the kids feel safe and comfortable and ready to learn wherever they are, in whatever program they are in. And with that, I'll pass it over to my co-facilitator, Emma.
Hello. My name's Emma Dole, and as mentioned, I'm the policy communications intern at ACT now. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm very excited to join and facilitate this training. I personally am a part of the neurodivergent community, and have seen neurodiversity in action with youth in a lot of settings.
All right, so that's who we are. If you ever have any questions for either of us, go ahead and throw those in the chat, and we'll try to keep monitoring that as we go. Um, I think it's important, and this is also good practice for your programming, to always have an objective and an agenda. It helps kids see what the course of the day is going to look like, and to know what they're getting into, which helps them regulate. So our objective is that you will be able to explain what neurodiversity is, so really something very concrete, and to identify some ways to support that goal in your program. So by the end of the day, if somebody asks you what is neurodiversity, you should be able to answer, and you should be able to say, like, here are 2 or 3 ways that I can support that goal in my program and with my youth. We have 5 sections as we'll be working through. First, just sort of that establishing the space, setting the ground rules, figuring out sort of how we fit in together. 2, Neurodiversity 101, What is neurodiversity? How does it fit into everything else? 3, we're going to talk about dysregulation and accommodations, which is really thinking about like how do we support neurodiverse youth. 4th, we're going to talk about practical next steps, which is where you'll spend some time really digging into your program and your environment and your situation to help kids. And Emma and I are going to give you one activity you can do today with your kids to help them mitigate dysregulation. And then finally, we'll end with reflection and closing, because no significant learning happens without significant reflection, something that I picked up a million years ago in theater school. So that's what we're doing today. Now let's get into it. So let's start with establishing the space. So we have a couple of meeting expectations. This is what I expect from you. This is what I expect from myself. First, be fully present. Look, I was a teacher during the pandemic. I know how distracting it is to be on your computer with your phone next to you, and you're trying to pay attention, but you got a million other emails you're supposed to be sending to people. Try, in this case, for the next 90 minutes to be here with us. Second, ask questions. This is an opportunity to really ask some of these deeper questions. And I may not have the answer, and Emma may not have the answer, but at least we'll be able to raise those questions for the group. And third, respect different identities. We're going to talk about normativity today. Neuronormativity, which is the idea that like there is a right way to think and a right way to interact with the world. And what I really want to challenge you on today is, how do we respect all brains in all cases for all kids and adults? How do we respect each other with the way that our brains work? So those are our meeting expectations. Who is ACT Now? I'll try to get through this pretty quickly. Emma and I both work for an organization called ACT Now, which stands for After School for Children's and Teens Now. We are a statewide coalition that advocates for quality and affordable after-school, youth development, and community school programs for youth across Illinois. So we do things like training. We do things like advocacy at the state level, trying to support after-school programs and community school programs throughout Illinois. We are a free coalition to join. So if you just Google ACT Now, you'll come across us. And you can access our trainings on STEM and problem-based learning, social and emotional learning, community schools, policy and advocacies, systems approach to family engagement, administration, and LGBTQIA plus understandings and safe places for OST. So again, that's a free resource. You can always access that. We're excited to have you working with us. This is where CAS met us through one of our trainings. And so we would love to see you at some of our trainings. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Emma to talk through some of the resources that we have.
So included with this training, we do have a resource guide available that will share all of the same or similar information that we're going over today. And this is called Neurodiversity and OST, and it's a guide that's designed to help after school and out of school time programs and youth programming to better support neurodiverse youth. So it includes strategies, policy insights, some actionable tools to create inclusive spaces. And some of the pieces include a first dive into what neurodiversity is, how it may present in look in youth. And then it'll also highlight some important federal legislation that protects the rights of neurodiverse youth and promotes inclusive programming and education. The guide also includes a number of actionable strategies to foster inclusivity, such as some accommodations to manage sensory input, structure and stability, and create inclusive environments for youth. And then at the end of the guide, there's also a glossary to help clarify some neurodiversity related terms. In addition to this full guide, we do have a one-pager to summarize the key concept. These are some pretty easy tools to use and share, and they aim to ensure that everyone has the information they need to effectively support inclusion of neurodiverse youth. We encourage you to explore the guide and work to implement the strategies, as well as share it with your colleagues and networks. And this guide is available on our website, and we can also provide printed copies on request. We will drop the link to that in the chat. I will pass it back to you.
All right. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. But first, I want us to really ground ourselves in our own programs and in what we do. And so I want you to look at this document that we're dropping in the chat. You can access it one of two ways. You can either download the Word document, or you can make a copy of our Google document. It's set up to automatically create a copy for you if you use Google Suite. And I want you to take 2 to 3 minutes, and I want you to think about what is the physical environment of your school or program or space. And so we've sort of established a couple of areas that we want you to think about. So things like, what are the kinds of light in your space? What are the common sounds? Do you have air conditioning in the summer? Do you have a radiator? Thinks about displays and decorations. Do you have uh, a very robust decorations? Is it very sparse? Think about space configurations. Is everyone set up in circles? Is it in rows? Is everyone sitting on the floor? And then finally, think about seating options. So, are all students in chairs? Are they big chairs or small chairs? Are they hardback chairs? Are they swivel chairs? Are they, bean bags? So I want to give you sort of 2 or 3 minutes, and I want you to sort of fill out part one, which is describing the physical environment of your school. And I'll give you 3 minutes on the dot to do that. And if you have any trouble accessing either of those documents, please let us know and we can help you get access to that. And try to think very sensorially, with the idea of like what is the physical experience of your program? And I want us to think about the fact that some of us are not in traditional educational spaces. Some of us, I saw this in the chat, we have a few people that are working in circus programs. We have people that, are working at the Shed Aquarium. We have people all over the place. So you might have very unique and different physical environments for your kids. So we should be thinking about that. All right, we have another minute left, and I would like somebody to share in the chat in a minute. You still have a minute. What are some of the physical environments of your program? All right, and that is 3 minutes. Um, just because you were the first person to comment, can we take you off mute and can you tell us a little bit about the physical environment of your space? Jess, teens take on climate. CAS team, can you guys unmute Jess?
She should be able to unmute herself.
I can now, thank you. When I first tried, it said the host wasn't going to let. Um, Thank you for that. So I am at few different schools, more than three now, but in general, they all have those big fluorescent lights, which a couple of the rooms you can hear a buzz from them too. So we tend to turn those off and use natural light when we can. Common sounds include that. One of the projectors I have plugs in and it makes a little buzz. So try and turn off the sound when we can. And then the decorations vary greatly, so I never am quite sure what I'm going to get. But in terms of seating, pretty typical from what you'd expect. They're tables with two students, two chairs per table, and they're just like the hard-backed, higher chairs you would find in like a science classroom. So they're a little bit higher off the ground. So
Oh,
that's
that's
usually my environment.
okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll get into what that means in a few moments, but thanks, Jess, for sharing that.
No problem.
I also saw in the chat that Becca has some thoughts. If we can take Becca off mute as well.
All right, I can be off mute, but I can't do the video right now. I am in a gym for both my programs, and so it's very tall ceilings and they echo a lot. And then it's a throughway for teachers to kind of walk through, which is good for community building, but it can be very noisy and very bright, which helps with our program because we like the energy, but it's not good for calm time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Becca. Okay, so that's sort of our opening question. Really starting to think about the environment that we are in. And we'll get into what that means in a moment. But in order to understand what that means, we have to talk about what is neurodiversity. That's sort of neurodiversity 101. And I'm going to pull up my chat again because I would like to keep up with what people are saying. All right. So I'm going to pass it over to Emma to talk about what is neurodiversity.
Yeah, so let's set a basis for neurodiversity. In 1998, Judy Singer, who was a sociologist from Australia, coined the term neurodiversity, stating that it refers to the virtually infinite neurocognitive variability within Earth's human population. It points out the fact that every human has a unique nervous system with a unique combination of abilities and needs. So, neurodiversity embraces differences in how individuals think, learn, and interact with the world. It commonly includes autism, ADHD, mood disorders, Down syndrome, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and neurological conditions such as cerebral palsy, but that's not an all-inclusive list. As noted, neurodiversity is a goal, and to reach this goal in all programs, advocacy for neurodiversity is necessary. This advocacy seeks to promote acceptance and inclusion in all areas of society, specifically in youth programming, and values the differences instead of stigmatizing them to create a world where everyone can thrive. Now I will pass it back to you.
Okay, so I like to really ground ourselves in what the experts say. And we have an expert that we really trust. Her name is Stephanie Boren. She's an assistant clinical professor at Northwestern in their speech language pathology program. And I'm going to drop some of her information in the chat because I think as you sort of continue to build out your programs, she is a really great content creator on things like Instagram and Facebook, and she does trainings. Really, really cool person. The next couple of slides come from her, with permission, of course. But just as you are building out, what does it mean to be neuroaffirming? in your programs, I really suggest that you follow along with Stephanie Boren. She's very cool. So there are a couple of words that we use in this field to talk about neurodiversity. And the first one, neurodiversity, is a mashup of two words. Neuro, meaning brain, and diversity, which means a variation in experiences. So neurodiversity means that there is a natural variation in the way that the human brains can be wired. Lots of different brains for lots of different people. All right? Things like privilege, marginalization, and intersectionality are also entwined with the concept of neurodiversity. You know, the experience of being a young Black man with autism is very different from a young white woman with ADHD. But we're going to talk about both of them using the framework of neurodiversity. All right? Which is the idea that all brains are beautiful. Now, another term you may have heard is the word neurodivergent. Neuro, brain. Divergent means going away from what we might call the norm, or we'll talk about the norm in a second. And that is having neurocognitive functioning that falls outside of that neuronormative, that the idea that there's a norm for brains, that centers a particular kind of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So this is where people who have autism may describe themselves as neurodivergent, or somebody with ADHD or bipolar would say, oh, my brain does not work in the way that the norm is expecting. So I am neurodivergent. I am diverging from that norm. Now let's say we have a lot of people, a lot of different brains, that you have the type of brain that our society is built for. In that case, you would be called neurotypical. You have brains that are typical. All right? So that means that you have neurocognitive functioning that falls within the norm of standards and the norm of expectations. And we're not saying that one is better or worse than the other, because neuronormativity says that there are brains of all kinds, neurodivergent and neurotypical. All right? And then the last term that I want to really pull from is going to describe your classrooms, which is that your programs are neurodiverse. All right? A neurodiverse program is any program that has both neurotypical and neurodivergent students, which means that I can tell you right now that the room that we are in, this Zoom room, is a neurodiverse room because we have neurodiverse people, we have neurotypical people. We are a neurodiverse room. So that's some of the big words, and those are some of the words you might see in our glossary. But let's dive a little bit deeper, which is into this tree of neurodiversity. All right, this tree talks about a lot of different ways that brains can look and can be wired. And some of them are very commonly associated with neurodivergent, like autism and ADHD. And some of them you might not think about, things like cerebral palsy or Tourette's or PTSD. Those are also ways that your brains can be rewired or wired in such a way that it does change the way that your brain works. And now, if we look at the top of this tree, those are the ways that people can be neurodiverse. And there are a lot of different ones. If you look down at the roots, we can get some of the causes of neurodiversity. Things like environment, things like biology, and society and culture. You know, the way that we are brought up in our world can change the way that our brains work. You know, I can say this, I consider myself part of this community because I have bipolar disorder. I know that I have bipolar disorder. I know that my mother has bipolar disorder. I know that my grandfather was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1910. That is part of my lineage of neurodiversity. But also, things like PTSD are also things that can create neurodiversity because of the situations that we're in, literally rewriting our brains. Now, on this page, I want to draw our attention to person first, versus identity first language. All right. So if we're talking about these two modalities, if we're doing person first, we can say this is a person with autism, versus an identity first language, which is an autistic person. All right. And what I'm going to tell you is that there is not a set right answer. So what I'm going to say to you is if you're asking your students or you're asking your colleagues or you're asking your friends and family, and you talk to somebody who may have bipolar disorder like me, you would ask them like, would you rather to be described as somebody, you know, are you a person with bipolar or are you a bipolar person? And I gotta say, for me personally, I describe myself as a bipolar person because I think that that identity is an important part of my experience rather than it's just something that is tacked on to me. But that's just me. And lots of other people will have lots of other experiences. They may want you to center their personhood rather than their identity. So that's something to keep in mind as we talk about neurodiversity. Similarly, let's talk about neuronormativity. All right. And, we love memes. Neuronormativity is the set of social expectations that assume that all brains function in the same way, that there is a normal way to think, learn, and behave. In schools and programs, this can show up in how we design our classrooms, how we structure our lessons, and how we respond to students' needs, often prioritizing the neurotypical way of processing the world, while unintentionally marginalizing neurodiverse students. All right. So as we look at our programs, when we recognize that we are in a neuronormative society, we can begin to challenge it, creating learning environments that embrace different ways of thinking, communicating, and experiencing the world. Our goal isn't just inclusion, it's ensuring that every student, regardless of how their brain works, feels valued and supported in your schools and programs. So that's neuronormativity, and it's a bit insidious, If we think about like, what does it mean to be a good listener, right? We talk about like, making eye contact and sitting still and like not interrupting or talking. We think about that as good listening. But really, that is neurotypical listening. It may not be every neurodivergent person's ability to listen. The requirement of eye contact for somebody with autism may be not something that will make them able to listen. All right, so that's neuronormativity. Something else that I want to bring up as we talk about Neurodiversity 101 is this nervous system regulation. So I want you to imagine a house with a big basement. All right? The upstairs brain, which is set in your prefrontal cortex, that is where we do the complicated things, learning, language, problem solving, making choices, regulating, and empathy. That all happens in our prefrontal cortex. And you get to hang out in your prefrontal cortex when you feel safe and your needs are met. All right? We all have students that when they feel comfortable in our programs, they learn better, they do more. Unfortunately, when students have to take shelter when they don't feel safe or have unmet needs, they push back into their limbic system and down into the brainstem. This is where we get things like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which are the survival modes. And it means that they can't access that things that they keep in the upstairs space, in the prefrontal cortex. So when we take and tie this back to neuronormativity, when we create spaces that don't allow neurodivergent youth to feel safe and have their needs met, they're kept in the downstairs brain, which means they can't access all of that cool stuff that we want them to do in their upstairs brain. And as you can see, Stephanie Boren has given us, where this research is coming from. So if you're ever interested in learning more about the science of this nervous system regulation system or any of these sides, we'll share the slides at the end of this. A couple of other things. The idea of spoon theory, which originally comes from the chronic pain community, but has largely been accepted in a lot of other spaces, including neurodiversity. Spoon theory is a way to understand the energy and effort it takes some individuals, particularly those who are neurodivergent or have chronic conditions, to get through the day. All right. So I want you to imagine that every task, from getting out of bed, focusing in class, socializing, each of those tasks cost a spoon, right? You keep 16 spoons in your bag and you can spend those spoons over the course of the day. Once a student runs out, they can't simply push through like others might. Once you're out of spoons, you're out of spoons and you can't do any of the other things that might require a spoon. Some days, students may start with a full set of spoons and be able to participate fully. Other days, they may wake up with only a few, struggling to manage even basic tasks. We call this idea fluctuating capacity. And you have definitely seen this in your programs or in your friend groups or with your family. And when you see it, it shows that like a student who maybe have excelled yesterday might need extra support today. And that's not inconsistency or a lack of effort. That's the reality of how their energy and cognitive resources work. As educators and youth workers, recognizing and respecting this variability helps us create more compassionate and flexible learning environments where students can thrive on their own terms rather than being punished for circumstances beyond their control. I remember being in college before I was diagnosed and before I was taking medication, and I would wake up in a depression, seriously in a funk. And taking a shower was the hardest thing that I can imagine. But of course, taking a shower is that first step to going to class, doing your homework, succeeding in school. And because I didn't have the support I needed from my community, from my school, I was left to struggle. And for a while I dropped out because I couldn't function in this program. So that's spoon theory. Something else that you may see with your students who are neurodiverse is the idea of autistic culture and social norms. So something that I want us to be thinking about is a concept called masking. Masking is when specifically autistic students, but it can also be ADHD students and, students with Tourette's and, any of the neurodiverse students. It's when these students unconsciously or consciously suppress their natural behaviors. For autistic culture specifically, it's things like stimming or avoiding eye contact or using alternative communication styles to fit into neurotypical expectations. So a student with autism in this case may act neurotypical for their peers. They're going to force themselves to make eye contact, to stay still, and to mimic social cues that don't come naturally. All of this to avoid being singled out or judged. And you might say to yourself, like, oh, that's code switching, right? That's learning to interact in normal society. But this idea of masking is exhausting, which leads to burnout, anxiety, and a loss of self-identity. As educators, it is crucial that we create environments where our neurodiverse students feel safe to unmask, to be themselves without the fear of punishment or inclusion. This means normalizing different ways of expressing emotions, communicating, and engaging in learning in the learning style. When students don't have to spend all of their energy on masking, they have more capacity, more spoons to learn, connect, and thrive. So that's something that I want us to think about as we are creating our systems for our students, is that when we help them be themselves, they are more likely to thrive. And then the last sort of concept that I want to bring up in terms of like what you can expect from neurodiverse students is something called rejection sensitivity. Uh, Many of you probably have experienced this already with students or with, people in your community, but it is an intense emotional reaction to perceived or actual rejection, which can be especially heightened in autistic students, as shown by the study by CAPS. Even small corrections, changes their tone, or being left out of a group can feel overwhelming, leading to distress, shutdowns, or the avoidance of certain situations altogether. And this isn't about being overly sensitive. It is a neurological, brainstem and limbic system response tied to deep-seated fears of exclusion. As educators, we can support these students by providing clear, kind communication, offering reassurance, and creating a culture of acceptance in the classroom. Instead of vague feedback or abrupt criticism, we can do things like using gentle, constructive language to give feedback and to validate their feelings as we do so. And that can make a huge difference. Giving students predictable routines, checking in on them privately, and emphasizing their strengths helps them build trust, resilience, and make sure that they are feeling valued and understood. All right, I know that was a lot of me talking, and that was a lot of really good content from Stephanie Boren. Um, I want to say that um, this may be nuanced. This is nuanced. This may be new for us. This isn't easy for us to create neurodiverse spaces. But I want you to know that you, right now, by being here today, are doing a good job. All right, so I've put, again, Stephanie Boren's contact information if you want to get in touch with her or follow her on Instagram. She posts a lot of really good content. So that's something to be looking for. And then she also gave us access to her Drive, which is free and available for everyone. She encourages people to use it, of resources that you can use in your programs and for your kids to create a more neuro-inclusive environment. Okay. So that was all Neurodiversity 101. And I promise we'll get back to sharing our own experiences in a second. Because we're going to start talking about dysregulation and accommodations. That part 3 of our training out of 5. Okay. No, go back. So I want to share an anecdote, and this is adapted from a TED Talk by Todd Rose. And in the 1950s and 60s, we had an incredibly diverse class of fighter pilots coming out of the Korean War, going into that sort of like late 50s era. And we had, on paper and in simulations, one of the most incredible pilot classes of all time. Really, really talented. Except we weren't succeeding in the actual air. Oh, yes, Rudy. These slides will be shared later. So we had this problem where we had this incredibly talented class of pilots, and we weren't being successful in trials. And so we dug into it as a country, and we discovered that the problem was that the cockpits weren't working, that the seats themselves weren't able to fit these large group of people. For the first time, we had women, we had, people of different races being allowed into the cockpit for the first time. And so the US government reached out to a bunch of designers and they said, how do we create one design, one chair that fits the greatest group of people? One tool that works for everybody. And what the prevailing thought process was, and this is, I'll admit, exactly what I thought, is that, you just take the average of everyone. You take the tallest person, the shortest person, you find the average, and that'll work for the largest group of people. You find the average. Unfortunately, is that what they found is that there were no average people. That you may be uh, tolerant than other people with shorter legs than other people, and you have all of these metrics. And if we look at this graph right here, we can see that when we create a chair for the average, we have actually created a chair that fits no one. That when we design for the average, we design for no one because there is no one who is actually average. And so when we think about this with our programs, when we design our programs for the average student, we have designed our programs for no one. So what do? You still need to serve the most number of people. And this is where we get into something that is called universal basic design, which is the idea that we can design for students on the outskirts, design for the edges, the tallest student, the shortest student, the student who is neurodivergent. And when we do that, we actually serve everyone. And you might think to yourself, that doesn't make any sense. If I am designing a program that works for the edges, how is that working for the kids in the middle? And so I want you to turn your attention towards this graphic, which shows a gentleman shoveling the stairs on a snow day. And the child in the wheelchair says, "Hey, could you please shovel the ramp so that I can go up?" And the gentleman says, "All of these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And the child in the wheelchair responds, "Yes, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." And this is something this is a really key understanding, which is the idea that when we create these accommodations, when we design for the outskirts, all students can use those accommodations and everyone succeeds. And so that's the idea of universal basic design, and is really going to lead us into our next section, which is talking about accommodations and how that can help with dysregulation. I'm going to pass it back over to Emma to talk a little bit about what dysregulation means.
Yeah, so like we said, designing a flexible system for the outliers, or in this case, neurodiverse youth, is benefiting all the kids as opposed to designing for the average youth, which is really not working for anyone. So as shown in the Universal Basic Design, or UBD, this intends to engage students, represent content, and promote student expression through a flexible instructional experience that incorporates a variety of options for learners. So to understand the need for UBD, we must understand dysregulation. Dysregulation occurs when stimulus of any kind is present, and this includes challenges in controlling emotion, behaviors, and physiological responses in a way that was not expected or considered typical for a situation. This can show up in a variety of ways and is tied to how someone's brain processes information and responds to stress. So, for example, if you're looking at a student, some signs of sensory dysregulation may include a loud voice, fast movements, inability to follow instruction, potentially uncontrollable laughter or fast speaking. And emotional dysregulation may look like impulsive behavior or an inability to manage behavior, overly intense emotions or mood swings, and a lack of emotional awareness. So, in the most general sense, overstimulation or dysregulation by an environment can be seen in youth, particularly with ADHD or autism. But there are many ways that a brain can respond to stimuli. So, in youth programming, youth must be given choices in how to increase or decrease their stimuli levels in order to combat this dysregulation. For example, accommodations could include different types of chairs, as was mentioned earlier. Maybe these chairs vary in texture, hardness, and style. For example, a beanbag chair. Other examples would be fidgets or sunglasses to combat the light in a room, earplugs to combat the sound, and the like. I will pass it back to you, Andrew.
Okay, so we thought a little bit at the top of this session about the physical environment of our program. And so now I want you to go back to that document, that Google document, that Word document, and I want you to do part two, which really focuses on how much stimulus is each of those environments. So if you're talking about like those fluorescent lights, if you're talking about, the decorations, if you're talking about the seating environment. So I'm going to get 2 minutes on the clock, and I want you to really think about each of those physical environments, how that might impact the stimulation it has on students and yourself. You got 3 minutes. And if you are having trouble accessing that document, please let us know so that we can get it to you. All right, we have about a minute left, and at the end of a minute, I'm going to ask for there a few people to share in the chat and maybe come off mute about the stimulus that your students are going to be experiencing. Okay, that's 3 minutes. I know that's fast, but we're gonna keep trucking. Can I get a few people to share in the chat? Oh, there we go. Thanks, Alexis. Alexis was talking about the lighting being a high stimulus, which can be distracting with varying levels of stimulus. Highly stimulating due to contrasting and textures. Okay. I'm also seeing space configuration, which could be distracting depending on where you are sitting in relation to the speaker. Love that. See that? I'm seeing that Jess is talking about the limits for stimuli. They lead programming in classrooms, so a lot of students have been dealing with the same stimuli for a long time. Mary is talking about working at an animal shelter, where are highly stimulating noises, smells, and sights. Okay. So yeah, I think we can talk about a lot of stimulus that can be created. And what I want to say with this, because the last time we did this training, there were people who were saying like, we're getting sort of defensive. I can't change this part of my environment. I can't change the lights. I can't afford to buy new chairs. All right. And that's true. That's 100% accurate. And so what I want you to think about as we talk about accommodations is, what are the levers you can pull? What are the things you can change? Obviously, there are a lot of things you can't, which makes the places where you can even more important. And that brings us to accommodations. Okay. So let's say that we have an environment that is very physically stimulating. All right. So that we need accommodation that will decrease the stimulation. Things in there might include earplugs and headphones. And we can make that agreement that, like, your headphones can't be loud enough that you can't hear me. We think of how many of us do our daily work with music in our ears. All right, maybe you can change the tone of the light. Jess was telling us that, like, they turn off the lights, those harsh fluorescent lights, and use natural lights whenever possible. Something else that I think is really important is the tone of your voice. If I talk like this and I'm very bright and I have a lot of loudness, a lot of energy, that can be a little bit overstimulating for some students. But if I slow down and I drop the register and I talk slowly and calmly, that is decreasing the physical stimulation for our students, the low and the slow. Also, we can talk about alternative seating options. I had a student, ADHD, a young man with ADHD, and every day he just needed to pace around the room. And he would 100% engage in the material and think, but he thought better while pacing. And so he and I had this agreement that if he were able to pace in the back where it wouldn't bother other students, that would be a fine way for him to participate. Things you can also do include creating quiet zones or sensory corners, places where students can take a step back from the space. And this is one that I really struggled with when I was a teacher, which is visual clutter. I had a student come up to me today and he goes, "Mr. Heitsusen, your desk stresses me out." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they go, you have 50 million pieces of paper and all of them are in piles and none of them are organized. I can't look at you while seeing your desk. And I was like, oh, that's a lever I can pull. And so I took an hour and I organized my desk. And I know that at least 3 other students commented on it the next day about how much easier it was to look at me because I had decreased the visual clutter. So again, some of these are levers you can't pull. Changing the lights. Maybe the program you're in has options about headphones. But try to think about what are the levers you can. Now let's say that you have a student who is feeling understimulated. These are our kids with ADHD. There are ways to do this without overstimulating other students. So for example, rubber bands on chairs. It allows them to bounce without creating a lot of noise. Creating space for movement and pacing, like I mentioned with my one student. Small, quiet fidgets to avoid distracting others. And I don't mean fidget spinners. Oh my God, those things were not small and quiet. They were loud and noisy. Also things like brain breaks, And again, alternative seating options. When in doubt, think about how the students are experiencing the space from their seats. Okay. I want to draw attention to some people talking about in the chat. Because Deirdre was saying that we think about how to decrease sound and light from teachers' smartboards when leading canine-assisted literary enrichment in classes. Teachers are often relieved and engage more when we get them off these boards for an hour. Noting the dog's sensitivity to sound and fast motion proximity helps everyone. Deirdre, I really want to thank you for that. And I was just saying a few other things in the chat. So if you are looking and keeping up with the chat, there's some people really thinking up very intentionally about their physical environments. So what we've been talking about so far is physical. It's taste, it's touch, it's smell, it's all those physical senses. But I'm going to pass it over to Emma again to talk about a different kind of stimulation and a different type of experience.
Yeah, so for part three, we're going to go through describing the experiential environment of your program. So if you want to flip back to the worksheet, this is going to include some norms and rules and types of modes and activities that occur in your program. And some things to think about for the norms and rules could include respecting all participants, engaging and active listening, using positive language, and some other potential behavioral expectations. And then some modes and activities to consider could be physical activities, collaborative, independent, technology based, discussion based, and the like. So we're going to give you a little bit of time again. Andrew, I don't know how much you set aside for this one.
3
3 minutes as well.
minutes. And I really want you to be honest, do you have enough? Is your ratio for adults to youth really wonky? Do you do a lot of, park and bark teaching? Nobody's going to be checking you on this. So try to be honest with yourself. Like, what is the experiential environment of your program? What are the norms, rules, and structures you incorporate? What are the types and modes of activities you do? So we have 3 minutes on the clock for that. And if anyone needs help getting access to these documents, please shoot us a message and we will get you connected. All right, we've got 1 more minute left. I'm going to ask for some people to share in the chat or come off mute um, about what is the experiential environment of your program like for students. We have another minute left. Okay. Can I get a couple of volunteers to share what the experiential environment of your program looks like? All right, Alexis is talking about some norms and rules in her program. Fidgets available for all, breaks available when needed, informal teaching practices, respect for all participants, and movement. All great rules and norms. Informal education, collaboration, and discussion as modalities of activities. And it's a higher ratio of adults a higher ratio of adults to kids with the younger kids, but that can vary depending on the age of the program. E. Calderon was talking about when they go into programs, it can be stimulating to have an animal in the classroom for people. which can be very exciting or overwhelming. That's entirely real. I know when I see an animal in a room, I get very excited, maybe a little too much so. Um, Great. Okay, so that's thinking a little bit about the experiential programming, which means that we can also talk about what are some accommodations we can use for our students in terms of regulation. And first things first, let's talk about structure and stability. Um, so, um, when we have structure and stability, it does a few things. First, it reduces anxiety and emotional stress. For many neurodiverse youth, especially those with autism and ADHD, they can find unpredictability overwhelming and anxiety producing. So when we have common structure and stability, it can reduce anxiety. Consistency in rules and expectations and consequences fosters trust and emotional safety. Knowing what to expect reduces fear of sudden changes or changes that might trigger sensory overload or meltdown. Structure and stability also provides opportunity for skill building. Neurodiverse youth often struggle with executive functioning skills like planning, organizing, and time management. When we build in structure, students can develop self-regulation and independence over time. For example, if in your program you have a predictable morning routine, that can actually help students learn to transition smoothly from home to school. Stability gives neurodiverse youth a reliable context to practice and strengthen skills from self-regulation, social interaction, and coping strategies. Repetition and routine are particularly beneficial for building and reinforcing new behaviors. Stability and structure also offer external scaffolding to compensate for these difficulties, making tasks more manageable. For example, a, a visual schedule, like the one we started with today, can give students step-by-step support as they get through the day, which minimizes their cognitive load. They don't have to spend their spoons in understanding where in the lesson they are. Three, structure and stability also facilitates focus and independence. And like I said, transitions can be especially difficult for neurodiverse youth. But if we create predictable structures to help them mentally and emotionally prepare, they are better supported. Examples here include timers. Knowing how long a student has for a certain amount of time that they can see really helps them. Also, countdowns and visual cues can help transitions smoother. Four, stability and structure can help reduce behavioral challenges. Oh, sorry. Inconsistent environments can lead to frustration, confusion, or outbursts. Stable routines and clear expectations reduce ambiguity, making it easier for neurodiverse youth to adapt and thrive. And finally, structure and stability builds trust and positive relationships. Stable environments help students build trust with the educators, with the peers, and with caregivers, as students feel like their needs are being understood and respected. So that's structure and stability. So what I want you to do is I want you to go back to your worksheet and do part number 4 and think about how does the experiential environment of your program impact students? I think specifically the question is, how does this impact the students that you have? Sorry. Um, Look at things like the number of adults you have. Look at the modalities that you use. Look at the norm and expectations. How does that impact the youth? And I'm going to put another 3 minutes on the clock. And we'll talk about that then. I'm just going through the chat. I'm seeing some really great things in the chat about what other people are doing. So I encourage you, if you finish early, to go through the chat and see sort of what your peers are working on. All right, we have another minute left. All right, I want to drive everyone's attention to the chat for a second because Margot said something very interesting, which is most adults in their program uh, who sign the participants up do not list what their learning disabilities is for the students. And this is actually a really great point because um, unless you are, in a school that has like IEPs, you may not know what's going on with the students in the students' brains, how their brains are wired. As a matter of fact, even if you are in a school with IEPs, students may not be diagnosed, or they might be just on the edge, and so they will never get diagnosed. So when we go back to our universal basic design, when we are designing for the outliers, we create an environment that even if we don't know what students' specific accommodations are going to be, we can help them. We can support them, even if we don't know exactly what they are. All right, I'm seeing a couple of really good things in the chat. Prioritizing flexibility and providing readily accessible accommodations helps you feel included and supported. Feeling safe knowing people are first aid trained for seizures, stress reductions, and some of the other providing health conditions. But we don't know every condition. Great. We work to relate it to personally giving a sense of community. Great. Yeah, this is all really good stuff. Again, I encourage everyone to be reading through the chat. I'm seeing some really great stuff here. But moving on, a couple of things that you can be thinking about for accommodations for structure and stability. These include things like visual schedules, consistent routines, advance notice for change. That's a big one. When working with any group, letting people know as far advanced as you can of a change will help them transition into it. Transitional tools, transitional warnings, anything that shows how we're moving from one circumstance to the next. Designated roles really helps students know what they're supposed to be doing in each environment. Especially for students that may struggle with social cues, knowing what they're supposed to be doing really helps. Again, minimal clutter. I'm not saying don't decorate your space. I'm not saying they don't have beautiful decorations. What I'm saying is when it feels messy, students are less likely to feel like there is structure and stability. And then finally, having clear learning goals and consistent formats really help with having more clear goals. Okay, so that was our section on accommodations and dysregulation. I hope you've gotten some out of that, some really uh, grounded exercises in what it can mean to have a more inclusive environment. Now we're going to talk a little bit about practical next steps. So we have questions 4, 5, and 6. We have sections part 5, which has 3 questions in it. And back in our sheets, I want you to think about what is a practice that you want to end in your program. You know, what is something that is happening in your program that, you want to do away with. So that could be, harsh fluorescent lighting. That could be visual clutter. Spend a little bit of time on what is a practice you want to end in your program. Think about a practice that you'd want to implement in your classroom tomorrow. What is something that you can do tomorrow that builds into neurodiversity? And then finally, what is a long-term goal to increase access for neurodiversity? Maybe something that won't take a day, but will take many days, will take many months to really ingrain in your program. So I want you to think about these last 3 questions while I look through the chat. And these are 3 bigger questions, so I'm going to give you a full 5 minutes on this. Something that I want to add as you're thinking about this, something I see in the chat that I really like from Miranda, which is that they've added these questions to their camp program registration. Does your student have a social, emotional, or mental consideration which you would like us to be aware? Yes or no? Share a little bit about your camper's social, emotional, or mental needs. And then specifically, and I really love this, are there situations in which your camper might feel overwhelmed? How does your camper react to feeling overwhelmed? That's huge. Especially because, like, parents, guardians, families may not want to say, like, oh, my student has a social, emotional, or mental needs. But they do know, yeah, when my kid gets overwhelmed, this is what they experience. And then, of course, I really love this. What are some strategies and tools that help your camper feel less overwhelmed? With some examples: mindful breathing, one-on-one time with a counselor, a comfort object. Love that. Love that so much. I feel really good about this room because you guys are doing some really good things already to support neurodiversity. And I think, what we can talk about a little bit more as we move forward towards, going towards a neurodiverse world is like, how can we do even more to support these students? Oh, Deirdre's doing some very cool things. Get rid of patterned fabric on blankets for dog team areas. Get solid colors that help indicate a special island with one dog. Classrooms we have in almost no spaces without symbols, graphics, rest for the eyes. Love that. All right, Jess is talking about having consistent agenda templates would be helpful for building youth leadership as they take on roles and start planning for themselves. And yes, turning off the big lights. That's a huge one. But also, I will say this. I get seasonal affective disorder, which means that once the sun sets in over the course of the day, I turn every light on in my house. In my living room, I have big overhead lights. I have string lights. I have lamps in every one of my corners because part of my neurodiversity is needing light. So that's something that you can navigate with your kid, with your students. We got about a minute left, and then we're going to share out. Building in frequent movement bio breaks as our classroom programming is often too sedentary. Kara, good to know. We have incorporated breathing and stretch breaks into our longer sessions. Love that. I used to make my kids do jumping jacks when I taught AP World. We get through half a session of lecture, and I'd be like, "All right, I need 5 jumping jacks right now." All right. Can I just ask? Is there anyone who would like to come, in the chat or come off mute and say like, what's something that you want to end? What's something you want to do away with in your program?
I guess the thing I want to end relates more to my long-term goal, which is to improve the registration process. I would like to end the lack of information or lack of relevant information we get about our participants. Finding those things out day of in the moment is not always the best. We have
Not
gotten
the
very good
best.
at being flexible in the moment and providing those things that we anticipate needing. But figuring out the right number of questions and the right way to ask those questions is really one of my long-term goals, to get that relevant participant information in order to accommodate for any of those needs that may pop up.
Alexa, I totally agree. The more information we have, the more we can support all of our participants. Ooh, Demi wants to get rid of strict age ranges for programming. Oh, I love that. All right. End strict policy about caregiver participation and volunteers from Randall. Love that. Neurodiversity not big a priority. Yeah, Rudy. Yeah, love that. Thank you. They're on it. Okay, so now I want to move forward because I actually have something that I think you can take away tomorrow. Yeah, if you wanted to do this tomorrow, and that is something that I call the energy meter. All right, and I didn't invent this. This is something that is out in the world. Um, so the energy meter. So this is an activity that you can do with all of your students, but specifically the students that struggle with dysregulation. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to create something that we call an energy meter. So you're going to draw a vertical scale with 6 points from bottom to top. And at the bottom, you're going to put asleep. And then it's going to go asleep, sleepy, settled, focused, amped, and maxed out. All right? And so you have a scale from basically like, I am not here to I am out of my mind. All right? And then on the left side, I want you to think about what is the energy needed for this activity? And on the right side, I want you to think about with the student, what is my energy going into this? And so at the start of an activity, take the youth aside or take the participant aside and say, hey, what is your energy right now? Is it, are you tired at the end of the day and you are exhausted? And so you are sleepy. But the activity is basketball, which means you need to be amped up and sort of ready to go. So now we've sort of identified an energy mismatch. And so at that point, then we need to think about like, how do we create accommodations that help the student still participate at their energy level, or strategies for the student to ramp up or ramp down their energy? And we can approach these in two angles, either from accommodations, how can we change the activity? And from strategies for the youth, how can we change how they're feeling for the kids? So yeah, that's a really easy, quick way to like match and think about accommodations for your kids, to think about what is the energy that an activity requires, and what is the energy of that student. And when students can do that themselves, we're trying to empower them, over the long term, that a student can be able to look into an activity and say like, oh, I know this activity is going to be very focused, and I know that I am very amped up. What do I need to do, or what does the facilitator need to do to help me succeed? And as kids get older and they get more experience, that's the direction we want to lead them to. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today. Um, because I want to make sure that we have time to do a few things. Please fill out this feedback form. This is how CIS makes sure that we are meeting the goals that you have for these trainings. And I'm also gonna throw that link in the chat in case you don't like to use QR codes. But please take us a minute to share your feedback on this session. Let us know how we did. Let us know how we can do better in the future. And with that, I want to say thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can shoot me a message at acnowillinois.org. You could also just give me a call. I know I'm a bad millennial, but I like phone calls. But just leave a message because I get a lot of spam calls. So yeah, thank you so much, and I will pass it back over to the CIS team. Thank you so much for your time and attention today, and I'll pass it back up.
Great, thank you so much. If you could please fill in the evaluation before leaving, that would be awesome. But thank you so much, Andrew and Emma. This was amazing, and thank you all for attending.
Are we still recording?
Yes, let me. Katya, can you?
Yeah, I got it.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.